Have you ever stopped to think about what's actually happening in your brain when you read a sentence? Every single second, your mind is performing this incredible, totally invisible act of linguistic gymnastics. Well, today, we're going to pull back that curtain and take a look at the hidden world of how your brain makes sense of language.
Okay, take a look at this headline. Just read it. As you do, something really interesting is happening inside your head. Your brain is like instantly scrambling to figure this whole thing out. Right? That's the question. Was it the farmer, maybe trying to defend himself? Or, and this is the fun one, was it the cow, somehow swinging an axe? See, without you even trying, your brain just jumped into action, trying to assign roles and build a story that makes some kind of sense. And this whole process, it's this unconscious marvel of engineering. It works so well, so fast, that you almost never even notice it's happening. But every once in a while, the system hits a glitch. And in that tiny moment of confusion, we get this rare chance to peek under the hood.
I want you to listen as I read this next sentence. Ready? The horse raced past the barn fell. Whoa, did you feel that? That little mental trip up right at the very end? It's like you were walking down a path in your mind, and then suddenly the path just ends.
So, what on earth just happened? That feeling of confusion, that need to go back and reread it, that's the mystery we're going to unpack today. Scientists call this a garden path sentence, and it's actually one of our best clues for understanding a totally hidden mental process. And that process is called parsing. You can think of it as your brain's own personal grammarian, working nonstop in the background to figure out a sentence's structure so you can get the meaning, who did what to whom. And sentences like the one about the horse, they're absolutely crucial because they show us the rules this hidden grammarian follows, especially when it gets confused.
Which brings us to a huge scientific showdown. For decades, researchers have been arguing about how parsing actually works, and that has led to two major competing theories about what your brain just tried to do.
All right, so let's get into it. On one side, you've got the garden path model. Think of this one as a strict rule follower. It uses grammar rules first, builds a structure, and then asks if it makes any sense. On the other side, you've got the constraint-based model. This one's more like a flexible detective, weighing all the clues at once, the grammar, the meaning, the context, to solve the puzzle of the sentence. So, the garden path model says your brain works in two steps. Step one, it just builds the absolute simplest grammatical structure it can, without even caring if the words make sense. That's why your brain heard the horse raced past the barn and thought, cool, sentence over. It's only when it smacks into that word fell, which breaks the simple structure, that it's forced into step two, a really clunky, conscious effort to go back and figure out what went wrong. Now, this whole model runs on a key idea called minimal attachment. And it's pretty simple, really. Your brain is efficient. You could even say it's kind of lazy. It will always choose the grammatical path of least resistance, the one with the fewest steps. It's just way easier to assume the horse raced is the main action, instead of building a more complicated idea, like the horse that was raced. But the constraint-based model says, hang on, our brains are way smarter than that. It argues that from the very first word of a sentence, your brain is running a kind of competition between all the possible interpretations. And it's using every piece of information it has. The grammar, sure, but also the meaning of the words, the context of the conversation, and even just how often you've heard a phrase put together that way before. So, which is it? A rigid rule follower or a flexible detective? To try and settle this, scientists went looking for answers straight from the source, the electrical signals actually firing inside our brains when we process language. And what they found was pretty amazing. Turns out, when you hear or read a sentence that makes no sense, like, I take my coffee with cream and castle, your brain produces a very specific electrical spike, about 400 milliseconds after that weird word. They call it the N400 wave. It's literally your brain's, wait, that doesn't make sense, alarm. But, and this is the fascinating part, if you hear a sentence with a straight-up grammar mistake, like, the cats won't eating the food, your brain produces a totally different signal. It's a positive spike that shows up a little later, around 600 milliseconds, and they call it the P600. The fact that the brain has these two separate alarms, one for meaning, one for grammar, seemed like a massive win for the two-stage garden path model. It seems pretty clear-cut, right? You've got a grammar check, then a meaning check. Case closed. Well, not so fast. The story gets a whole lot messier once you take language out of the lab and put it back into the messiness of the real world. Check out this brilliant experiment.
People were told, put the apple on the towel in the box. But here's the twist. What they saw completely changed how their brain parsed that sentence. When they saw only one apple, which was sitting on a towel, their brain went down the garden path. It thought on the towel was the destination, and they got confused. But when they saw two apples, one on a towel and another on a napkin, their brain used that visual context instantly. It knew on the towel was just describing which apple to move. They never got confused. And that is huge support for the constraint-based model, showing that context shapes our understanding from the very beginning. So now we've got conflicting evidence. Brainwaves seem to point one way, but real-world experiments point another. It looked like a stalemate. And then a new experiment came along and delivered a shocking twist that challenged what both theories thought they knew. See, both models agreed on one fundamental thing. Ambiguity is bad. It should always be harder and take longer to process a confusing sentence than a clear one. But a study by Van Gompel and his colleagues found the exact opposite. They called it the ambiguity advantage. Sometimes your brain can actually process an ambiguous sentence faster. How is that possible? Well, if both possible interpretations are plausible, it doesn't really matter which path your brain takes first, because neither one leads to a dead end that forces you into that slow, painful reanalysis. Okay, so this suggests our brains are way more flexible and probabilistic than either model first imagined. But that just opens up an even bigger question. If the rules for parsing aren't even totally fixed inside a single brain, are they at least the same for everybody on Earth? Well, turns out, nope, not at all. If you give an English speaker the sentence, the journalist interviewed the daughter of the colonel who had the accident, they usually assume the colonel had the accident, the noun that came last. But if you give a Spanish speaker the exact same sentence structure in Spanish, they'll usually assume it was the daughter who had the accident. Even our most basic parsing strategies are shaped by the language we grew up speaking. This leads us to a much more modern idea called the tuning hypothesis. And it suggests that your brain's parser isn't running on some fixed universal rulebook. Instead, it's more like a machine that's been tuned over your entire life by listening to your native language. It learns the statistical patterns, and when it hits a fork in the road, it just makes the bet that has paid off most often in the past. So where does that leave us? Well, what's happening in your head right now isn't some simple two-step process. It's this incredibly dynamic word-by-word dance. It's a system of bets and predictions, not rigid rules. Your brain isn't trying to achieve a perfect, flawless grammatical analysis of every single thing you hear. It's aiming for an interpretation that's just good enough to let you get by at the speed of real life. And that leaves us with one last pretty big thought to chew on. If something as basic as understanding a sentence is really just a series of good enough guesses, all tuned by your own personal experience, what else is? How much of what you think of as objective reality is really just your brain's best, fastest, and most convenient interpretation of all the data coming in? Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.